It's a fact of life that challenging fundamentals of physics can only be done privately. A scientist who dares to do that, even if he or she has all the correct arguments in the world, is necessarily a loner, as that probably has always been in history. Even if one can prove unequivocally, without any uncertainty, that the fundamentals of physics are flawed, his voice will remain unheard. Public policies which make a voice heard follow different guidelines. These different guidelines of the public policies are not in the least concerned with the fact that flawed worldview caused by flawed understanding of basic scientific concepts is much more harmful than any harm the neglect of publicly advertised science can incur on society. The harm wrong fundamentals cause consists in both enormous economic waste and in perpetrating ad infinitum of pouring out of more and more piles of further nonsense. Because nonsense can only breed nonsense, catching in a vicious circle, amplification, bulging of this nonsense balloon. There is no end in sight, and those benefiting from this swelling of senselessness become its most avid, most ardent guardians, basking in its vice benefits. To say nothing of the fact that wrong science fundamentals will harm directly also the very science topics favored by the official science policies, if those who institute these science policies care at all about integrity. The most paradoxical fact is that the wrong fundamentals in question can be righted in one stroke by the forces shaping up public policies. Because writing of science fundamentals to eschew societal, intellectual, moral, and financial waste can be really unequivocal, beyond a shadow of a doubt. And why don't these forces do that? Why don't they take measures? Why don't they fund and promote righting the wrongs of science? Is anybody's guess. Instead, attention is always drawn to topics which always inherently contain uncertainties, in addition to neglecting any underlying flawed scientific fundamentals, which are oftentimes very remotely, if at all, connected with the topics of science promoted at the center of public interest. The societal forces, however, don't miss the chance to falsely proclaim those science topics inherently prone to uncertainties as the opposite, as unequivocal. Well, after all, who can argue with the powers holding both the knife and the bread? Society, deprived of proper treatment of science, has gotten used to believing that it is the political power that makes truth, and accepts that sheepishly. Speaking of those social issues, tangential to science but foisted as real science, we can take as a random illustration for the governance of that social over scientific approach the vaccination controversy. The use of vaccines for society as a whole is hard to question, even if it is admitted that medicine is not an exact science. The center of the vaccine dispute, however, is not whether vaccines work. They do. What worries some groups is the following ethical question. Is it acceptable to allow for even few inevitable victims to fall in the name of such public good as vaccines? Similar is the dilemma connected with the capital punishment. The opponents of capital punishment cite the fact that it is always possible, and there are proven cases, to have miscarriage of justice causing an innocent to experience the wrath of the guillotine or the syringe, depending on the local judicial code. And as a result, the unsuspecting citizen in whose name the justice is served to become an accomplice in murder. The difference is that capital punishment is only an indirect deterrent for future assassins, while vaccination protects very directly the population, although at the expense of probably inevitable victims. This is why all governments are so much categorical and in cahoots in upholding vaccination. One may argue that this applies to every medicine. There is no medicine without side effects. This fact, however, provokes even more the need for ethical analysis and isn't an argument against it. The mentioned difference between the social effect of capital punishment and the social effect of vaccination may explain why it is easier for some societies to swallow the collateral damage from the capital punishment. Thus, while in Europe it is removed to a man, capital punishment dominates in the United States. 31 out of the 50 states of the United States have capital punishment as part of their law. Conversely, vaccination, which directly affects the prevention from epidemics, is unconditionally accepted everywhere, no matter what polemics and controversies some are attempting to stir up, taking advantage of the uncertainty which will always be part of our understanding of medicine referred to the concrete individual. The inherent uncertainty which characterizes medicine when referring it to concrete individuals weakens the arguments against the critics of vaccination. A paper claiming that vaccines cause harm has been retracted because of a claim that the authors have received money from parties partial to the question, and such acceptance of money from connected parties comprises conflict of interest. However, conflict of interest is a circumstantial evidence against the vaccine revisionists, and not a direct evidence against the scientific claim. Obviously, the critics have not been able to muster a direct evidence, which is probably an impossible task to begin with when individual cases are concerned, in view of the mentioned inherent uncertainties in such cases. Thus, vaccination is a public imperative, especially when a concrete individual is to be assured that his or her children will not suffer, is not a question of science, but is just public policy. The organized society always has the tendency, if not the cruelty, to protect the group at the expense of the individual. The society in question will never take pity on the enemy and allow the enemy to conquer it, because, see, if it brings the army in defense, there will be friendly fire as well. Unfortunately, in other hybrid sciences, similar to medicine, subordinate to inevitable uncertainties, such as, for example, the recently brought forth hybrid science called climate change, it is also the public policy and not the rigorous scientific truth that is the motor. And which is even worse, the political pressure forces entire governments to pronounce as unequivocal that climate change is caused by human intervention, has anthropogenic origin, despite the fact that the ultimate scientific authorities, such as the 11 World Science Academies, most unequivocally conclude in their joint statement that, quote, there will always be uncertainty in understanding a system as complex as the world's climate. There will always be uncertainty in understanding a system as complex as the world's climate. The subtitle reads, Climate Change is Real. Which can be used as a one-liner for political purposes. But the real scientific conclusion of the ultimate scientific authorities is that there will always be uncertainty in understanding world's climate. Or take another telling example. Social, administrative, and not scientific is the method to impose on society the theory of evolution through a ruling by the United States Supreme Court in 1987. In such way, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds its obligation to rule in favor of the secular character of the United States, as the Constitution requires. The paradoxical thing in this case, however, is that for the correct scientific doctrine to triumph, nothing less than an administrative action was needed. This tells us that the scientific community has no sufficient authority to implement correct science itself. In the case discussed, the easily establishable threat to the public interest, the secular character of the United States being under threat, coincides with the opinion of science. Such coincidence, however, may not always be observed if criteria other than the criteria of science are applied, as plentiful historical examples show. The scientific community, however, has turned out to be weak to have society adopt a scientific approach by using the instruments of the scientific community itself. What should we say then about the even greater harm to the public interest incurred by vastly and forcefully imposed erroneous doctrines on science, especially concerning the fundamentals of science, the fundamentals of physics? Those flaws in the fundamentals of physics cannot be at all that obvious to the United States Supreme Court due to its wanting scientific background. No matter how much these flaws, in fact, lack any uncertainty whatsoever. As a result, asking this pivotal question becomes inevitable. Shall the society continue to tolerate these false doctrines in physics aggressively presented as great science, just because the United States Supreme Court is unqualified to deal properly with science and therefore is unable to see the problem? To say nothing of the lack of political and economic interests on the part of the big corporations, their bottom line not being directly affected. The answer which imposes itself, unfortunately, is in the affirmative. Yes, these flawed doctrines, falsely presented as great science, will remain flawed and will remain widely foisted. And they will continue to undermine societies because their resolution is simply not interesting in any way to anybody personally. sorely needed correcting the flawed fundamentals of physics is of no personal concern to anybody, no matter how much they, in the long run, affect everybody's life. Concerned mothers and Robert De Niro will rise about the vaccines. They will discuss them and will present films and decide to withdraw these films about the vaccines from their film festivals just because they are of concern to their own children. Medicine is what is of concern to them because medicine concerns them personally. And that personal concern is the only thing they care about and understand to be worthwhile and therefore is of interest to them, and which they also call science for more authority. It is not by chance that the National Science Foundation, the fund which supports the real science, is 10 times as poor compared to the National Institutes of Health, which take care of the medical studies. Medicine is what people understand as something needed in the world. This is where the wealthy give their money personally, because medicine deals directly with their own frailties. The true science, the science that deals with the general understanding of the world around us, is gone to the dogs. Honestly speaking, the grass, the flies, the flowers, and the animals, this is what is of concern to the youth, to the ecological activists, continuously urged by various funds to be, as part of their job description, incessantly worried about the fate of Mother Nature. I, me, mine. I, me, mine. This is the ecosystem which is of interest to the majority. This, despite appearances, is in fact an expression of a deepest egotism concealed as idealistic care for the environment. A self-serving idealism which, because of its hypocrisy, is even worse than pure egotism. It cannot be otherwise, since hypocrisy as well as secrecy and corruption are the cornerstones of our society. Without them, it will collapse. That is the tragic truth of our life. I'd like to add one more thing. In one's everyday activity as a scientist, when carrying out the usual research in some specific topic, one rarely devotes time to the fundamentals, especially the fundamentals of physics. Scientists are very busy with their own concrete projects, sometimes additionally burdened by their teaching duties, and are reluctant to be distracted by side issues. Most scientists would consider dwelling into the fundamentals as a waste of time because the general feeling usually is that those who laid those foundations have already done their homework and there's nothing more to be contributed to that, let alone being paid, getting grant money to question the fundamentals of physics. I can, however, see how can someone who calls himself a scientist remain nonchalant and carry on in the same rut as if it is up to somebody else to be concerned when he or she happens to encounter serious problems in the basics of science. How can a real scientist proceed with studies in particle physics and get involved in research at CERN when he or she sees the problems right at the doorsteps of that area of physics, and these problems hinder the progress at every step of the proper research? How can a mathematician who clearly sees and admits that the math of quantum mechanics is sheer nonsense, in the same breath accept that physicists may somehow have good reasons to consider that nonsense useful to them? Probably this is an expression of the individual weakness the individual scientists, which makes up the collective weakness of the science collegiate, incapable to correct itself by using its own mechanisms, and instead delegating the power of such correction to entities external to science, such as the US Supreme Court. Such abdication of science from its pivotal role of truth corrector is a sure, sad harbinger of the demise of society. No technological advances and seeming successes of companies juggling with technological trivialities can save a society which has abandoned reason in favor of market practices. Society agreeing to tolerate science based on fundamentals which can be shown unequivocally to be wrong, which at the same time substitute the need to correct those unequivocally wrong fundamentals by discussing and promoting publicly hybrid sciences that are always subject to uncertainties, such as climate change. Such society is doomed.